Hello everyone, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second last day of NAPCAN's National Child Protection Week webinar series. My name is Rani Kumar and I am the Deputy CEO of NAPCAN. It's my responsibility today to guide you through a very important conversation. This conversation is about the dollars. Are we being clever in how we invest in keeping children safe and well? And this is at all levels of government. But before we get into that, I'd like to start by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional owners of this beautiful land. Today, I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people here in Sydney, and I'd like to start by paying my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to elders from all the lands from which you may be joining today, and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues who are logged on. It's really important also at NAPCAN to acknowledge the children, because that's what this week is all about and where culture will live on. Now, just a quick bit of housekeeping. If you're not familiar with GoToWebinars, the control panel is on the right-hand side normally. It's like a thin panel where you will be able to see your question panel and be able to participate through that function. So please keep sending your questions throughout the session. We're really happy to receive them and collate them to get to the discussion part after we've had a bit of a chat with our presenters to begin with. If you run into any technical issues, the NAPCAN team is in the background. They'll be able to help you, and their details are in the contact details are in the chat function. If there's any handouts or links that are mentioned today, they'll also go into that chat function, so check them out there. If there's anything specific you want to ask about in terms of getting links, also feel free to ask through there. These webinars will be recorded and posted to our website in due course, along with a resource sheet that will capture some of the key insights and have those links and any handouts that were shared today. They'll also be emailed to anyone who's been registered, so you'll get them, but you can share it through the recordings on our website. And just to kind of orient us a little bit, we're here today as part of NAPCAN's National Child Protection Week, and Child Protection Week is about sharing the message that every child in every community needs a fair go. This year, we're also focused on the theme Where We Start Matters. On Monday, NAPCAN launched a call for action for the Commonwealth Government to convene a national summit to prevent child maltreatment. You can hop onto our website and have a look about some of the details that we've got on that, about what we're calling for, or contact us directly to discuss this call. The call is really about bringing together diverse perspectives with key leaders and experts to be able to align systems and think across what we already have. And it's really very much goes to the heart of the conversation that we're having today. When we looked at the child maltreatment study results that were released earlier this year, we know that we can't look away and hope for things to just improve on their own. We need to stop doing the same things and expecting a different result. So what does this fresh way of looking at prevention look like? We thought a summit is a great way to bring together those key thinkers, lived experience, and really talk it out and figure out how we can align systems, which these presenters that we have today will be able to really help us understand and unpack more what's blocking us from that progress. So today's conversation is about spending, and particularly how that sort of large scale spending on systems impacts children. There are significant costs associated with child abuse and neglect. And of course, these costs are mainly personal to the individual and the family, but there are costs that go beyond that to economic and structural costs that are associated with child abuse. And we want to unpack those myths today about what these systems are and how they operate. We know there are ways that we can spend in a more effective way that brings the child at the centre of our interventions and is able to actually make a difference for prevention. So the question for our panelists today really is to focus on, should we restructure our investment to enable better outcomes for children and their families, and how would we do that? So let's get into it. Our fantastic panelists are going to join me now, and you'll be able to meet all of them. First up, we've got Natalie Siegel-Brown. Natalie commenced a 5-year term as a full-time commissioner with the Productivity Commission in April 2022. Natalie was recently the Managing Director of Childwise, and prior to that, she was the Queensland Public Guardian. Natalie has worked across New South Wales and Queensland Government in leading public policy and service delivery in domestic and family violence, in statutory child protection, ageing and disability. So lots of expertise to share there. We also have Dr. Robin Milden, who's an internationally recognised figure in the field of implementation science, evaluations in health, education and human services. She's the founding CEO of the Centre for Evidence and Implementation, a global social purpose organisation whose work now spans 8 countries. She's also an adjunct professor at Monash University and has 2 impressive roles at the National University of Singapore as visiting associate professor and co-director of the Behavioural and Implementation Science Interventions Centre. Amongst other things, Robin is also a director on the board of the Benevolent Society. And last but not least at all is Professor Sharon Bessel. Sharon's a professor of public policy at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. She heads the Children's Policy Centre and the Poverty and Inequality Centre. She's the co-host of the Policy Forum Pod. Good podcast, please do go and check it out later. Sharon's research interests revolve around issues of social justice and human rights and focus on 2 broad areas: social policy, social justice and the human rights of children, and secondly, the gendered and generational dimensions of poverty. In 2019, she was named the Australian Financial Review's as one of Australia's 100 Women of Influence. So welcome all, illustrious panel. Look forward to hearing from each of you in turn, and then we might get into a bit of a discussion and also get those questions live from the audience. So please do keep sending things through as we get going. I just wanted to do a little bit of an intro to say, you know, some of you might be wondering why NAPCAN chose this topic as a focus webinar for Child Protection Week. Why do we need to really talk about money and dollars when there's so many other practical things that we should be talking about in terms of working with children and their families? But we hear a lot about the inefficiencies in systems and how we need structural reform. We need to break down silos between portfolios and departments. And what does that actually all mean? How do we do that? Why would that make things better for kids? So the idea today was to bring 3 experts together and have a bit of a discussion about, let's peek behind that conversation and see what might be stalling progress, as well as what it would mean for all of us to get behind making that systems change happen. So first up, we have Natalie. Natalie, would you like to share some of your initial reflections on systems reform from your previous roles and what you're seeing now as a commissioner at the Productivity Commission?
I surely would. Thank you so much, Rani. I really appreciate that. And thank you for your lovely acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you all from Turrbal and Yagara country here in Meanjin in Brisbane. And I'd like to also acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the meeting today. I really owe so much of my lifelong learning to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people I've worked with in the communities I've worked with, and I feel really lucky to be continuing this journey at the moment with my colleagues on the Queensland Independent Truth and Treaty Board. One thing I always really like to acknowledge as well whenever I have the great opportunity to speak is that I've been born with a lot of privilege in this country. I might be from an ethnic minority, but I recognise I still grew up with so much privilege in this country that our First Nations people did not. And I acknowledge that when I talk, I'm talking from that place of privilege. And I think that's important to acknowledge because, of course, that can always colour our lens on the world. So I think that's really important. The other thing I need to acknowledge, or maybe confess to you all, is that I am not an economist like my colleagues at the Productivity Commission. Sorry, people, I'm a lawyer. Don't hold that against me. My role at the Commission is to look at productivity issues through a social policy lens. My career has not been productivity. I've spent the last 20 odd years in child protection in different state governments, both in state child protection departments as well as an independent child death inquirer in Western Australia and Victoria. I've worked in a number of Aboriginal community controlled organisations, including an Aboriginal medical service in the Kimberley in child protection and formerly the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, and as Rani mentioned, most recently as an oversight body for child protection and youth justice here in Queensland. And child protection continues to play a huge part of the work that the Productivity Commission is currently leading in relation to closing the gap as well in terms of reviewing government progress against closing the gap, I should say, and the education review we've most recently finished. I wonder whether many of you think seeking productivity in child protection is kind of a dirty thing, because I certainly know that some people do. And when you think about the way productivity is defined, or getting the best bang for buck, it's often defined as the most efficient input for the maximum output or outcome. And that sounds pretty cold and dehumanizing. But until you start defining the outcome you're inputting for, as families that can care safely and lovingly for their kids, as seeking to cease cycles of trauma and intergenerational trauma, as family recovery, that's when things start to change. And interestingly, many child protection systems across Australia and across the developed world would say that all of those things I just mentioned are front and centre of their child protection systems. But actually, when you look in practice, most of them tend to operate around a paradigm of removing kids to safety, and some of these other outcomes that we would treat as, you know, a productive, valuable child protection system, one that is aimed at ceasing intergenerational trauma, as family recovery, start to get treated as ancillary or even as nice to haves. And ironically, we see a whole lot of disproportionate heavy input to the removal outcome, and then very tiny input in relation to those outcomes that we might think should be at its core. And sometimes it might even look like we're so busy pulling the lever to increase input into that removal system that it doesn't really meet the definition we would give of maximum outcomes for kids and families. And even the way we measure outcomes of productivity can seem really misaligned. So we tend to measure output simply as rescuing people, as removing children to safety, without conceiving the output as needing to reduce the people that need to be rescued. And obviously that concept of rescuing and removal can be overlaid with what might be regarded as some very old patriarchal and even colonial paradigms, which don't actually get to the heart of causation and what's going on for a family and how they need to be supported to recover as a family and to successfully parent. There's not a lot of time spent in modern child protections, either here or abroad, proportionately, about being curious why parents or carers who abuse and neglect children do it, or even enabling them to answer some of those questions so that we might more accurately address those causes. And I think what you'll see I'm trying to put across today is that actually giving children and families a voice in the system, sometimes seen as a secondary obligation of the system, is actually tantamount to a productive system. If you read any media article, or even if you're one of those people inside a department who's reading a cabinet budget submission, you'll see the investment in frontline workers in child protection never seems to be enough. And under the current systems of child protection, that problem's probably always going to exist. There'll never be enough investment, because the way we currently found our systems tends to be in such a way that there's an insatiable thirst for resources. And I would argue, in the way we design some of our systems or unintentionally implement some of our systems, we're actually perpetuating demand and increasing demand. And as you know, many will say to us, it's impossible to divert money away from the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, from that removal system. But I'm not convinced that we've actually looked at where the pillars of this, at the actual pillars of the system. I'm talking about the core operating logic of modern child protection systems. Have we asked ourselves whether they really are centred on addressing the cause of why families might perpetuate or perpetrate abuse and neglect, as opposed to just constantly addressing symptoms? Because I think we might find we have child protection systems that continue to drive up demand instead of reducing demand over time. And that's not a money thing. That's a human rights thing. That's an outcomes thing. That's a thing that all of us on this call are working for. So to do this, I would argue we need to change the core foundations of systems from remove this child to safety to rather centering systems on how do we break cycles of trauma, of abuse and neglect, so that they're not perpetuated by parents again today, and so that the parents that we're working with can successfully parent this child into the future and future children they might have, so that their children can lovingly parent for generations to come. Of course, there will be examples where removal can't be completely ruled out of the equation. But before I go on to some of the science behind this, and of course, Robin will go much more deeply into the science behind this, I want to tell you about an example that I came across when I was working in the New South Wales government of an executive director in a region who could see this but said, but what's my role? How can I change this? I'm stuck with this system that has this core foundation that I can't change. She had a pool of funds. It wasn't a huge pool of funds, but it was in a really high needs area of Western Sydney. And she said, instead of putting this into funds for resi care or foster care, I'm going to find 10 families where the kids are on the borderline of what the state might use as its legislative threshold for removal of the child. And instead of removing those kids, I'm going to put some money in and reverse the paradigm. So the child protection worker will walk into that household and say to the family, what do I need to do to support you so that things will change? And suddenly the family's voice became front and centre of that. So one of the examples was a young man with quite severe disability who was being cared for by his grandmother. And as she became more elderly, she was having trouble remembering to provide his medication and providing his food. So instead of what might have been a removal, the money was invested in putting food on the table and providing an in-home nurse to support grandma with providing medication. And there was a beautiful relationship between this young boy and his grandma. There were several examples of this. Across 10 examples, this executive director had spent, in an example like the one I just gave you, about $75,000 for the year. Had that child been removed, it would have been approximately $400,000. And the toll, the emotional trauma, the detachment, the attachment trauma that would have been disrupted, you can't even put a price on. Instead, that family unit was retained. Of the 10 families where she saved that money by supporting family recovery and supporting successful parenting, each of one of those instances produced examples where there was a huge cost saving, but interestingly, almost all 10 families never came back to the attention of the child protection system again. A really powerful example of how changing the paradigm reduces financial cost, but the human toll that has been avoided is immeasurable. But when I look at the core of modern child protection systems, I feel that unless we've got some people doing things like that, in the main, I do see a system akin to a hospital, which only has an emergency department. So if you think about a hospital that only has an emergency department, think about a person with chronic disease who'd be revolving through that doorway again and again. Think about the price of the human suffering. Think about the cost to the public purse. If you suffer from a serious illness, we take it for granted there's a public health approach which addresses the causes of chronic disease. You're not going to walk in and someone will put a band-aid on you, meanwhile the cause of the problem goes unaddressed. So Nadia, if I can just trouble you to very quickly flash up my first slide, and people, I should tell you, I'm not a lover of slides. I'll probably do appallingly at using any form of PowerPoint in this presentation. Hopefully our first slide will come up. This is the public health approach. Robin is going to probably delve a lot more and far more eloquently into this than me, but I want to pop it in front of your eyes to refamiliarise yourself with the way the World Health Organization conceptualises the concept of a public health approach in violence prevention. It's fairly similar to the way we use it for disease. So if you suffer from diabetes, we've done a heap of research into all the factors that may have contributed to that in the first place. You'll see a cardiologist who will help you determine the environmental causes, what support you will need so that you don't need to come back to the attention of emergency again. They will actually start looking at causation. However, we don't have a root cause approach like the public health approach in child protection. We don't tend to use the causes of what makes someone perpetrate or perpetuate child abuse and neglect, and all of the trauma factors that neuroscience has in fact investigated. We haven't brought that really cutting edge field, which uses neuroscience of how people react to situations based on past trauma in the way we think about our statutory responses. And in fact, the child protection system is very much a response system whose core is the emergency department. And if you used an emergency department in a hospital as your long-term response, you can imagine how much more damage you'd cause. So Nadia, if I can ask you to turn that slide off, just because I'm absolutely hopeless with using slides. I'll use another health analogy, if you'll forgive me. If governments and bureaucracies funneled all of their resources into the ambulance, and if we call it the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff or the emergency department, if you've got no resources to stop people falling off the cliff, there'll never be enough ambulances. And that, for an economist, is one of the most problematic equations. And the Productivity Commission recently did a report that showed that it's that human services sector where we're getting some of our least productivity. So the ideal, I would think, for those of us here who are so dedicated to protecting children would be that we're so successful at intervening in child protection that over time we don't need a child protection department, or at least a far smaller one. But despite the talk of prevention and early intervention, certainly across my career, I've rarely seen systems based on wholesale scientific approach to why or what would cause people to behave in a particular way towards the child or themselves. And I think if we don't have a system that is responsive to those causes, we're never going to make a heap of progress. And you can see in places like Queensland that we are actually increasing the number of children that are being removed into care, and in particular Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people. Which gets to a really important point about closing the gap. The National Agreement on Closing the Gap has a priority of shared decision-making with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And there is a key concept in there that is actually so strongly applicable to our work in child protection, because a productive system, one that gets the outcomes we want for the least amount of input, would use the voices of kids and families and communities. It would draw on that to deeply look for those voices, listen to them, and then decide together with those families what would work for them. That's good policy making. Correctly diagnosing the source of an issue and how to address it cannot be done without the voices of the people at the heart of it. So I just want to give you a little contrast on how differently we deal with some public policy issues to child protection, where sometimes we might get stuck. Nadia, if you can just flash up that second slide for me, please. Thank you so much. I think I'm really cool because I've got some graphs here, and I never use graphs. I'm always stuck with words. This is a very oversimplified, crude example, but just bear with me for the sake of the concept. So top left-hand corner, I'm looking at the national approach to road deaths in this country. And you can see that between 2008 and 2021, road deaths in Australia have actually decreased by 20%. Has there been a causative approach to the offending behaviour? For those of you who live in New South Wales, you might recall that there was an advertising campaign for speeding, and it had photos or videos of somebody speeding and then somebody on the pavement going like this, which insinuated a small appendage of a man who was showing off. And that's because there had been work done by the New South Wales government that demonstrated a lot of speeding occurred because the speeding that occurred was often done by young males in risky behaviour to show off to their mates. Now, whether that's accurate science, I'm not 100% sure, but it has been quite a successful campaign. Now, there is no doubt that there are other factors that have affected a drop in road deaths. Car safety is improved, right? I don't know about you, but my car screams at me if I try to even come out of my lane. But equally, what's happened in this policy area is that governments have focused on cause. And the policy and campaign approaches that they've taken in reducing road deaths have focused on why people drive in a manner that causes fatalities. However, if we look at child protection, you can see the stats look quite different. And in child protection, again, we're seeing that approach that is really all about identifying where abuse has occurred and trying to remove the victim as opposed to address the cause. And what we're measuring in child protection seems to be really different too. In road deaths, we are measuring return by how we've prevented deaths from occurring before they happen. But in child protection, we don't actually measure prevention. We're measuring how many people we've captured once abuse has occurred. That causation approach it appears to be largely absent. The system isn't founded on why someone behaves that particular way against a child and trying to address that while accounting for the value of the missing bit here, of course, is there is very little account for the value of the relationship between parent and child and the ongoing damage of removal to the child, which has to be a factor in the way we value our system. So Nadia, if you don't mind, I'll turn off the slides and I am going to finish up very shortly. But I think in terms of value for money in child protection, we'd all agree that any question about investment should ask things like, how do we invest for maximum human rights? How do we invest to increase the number of kids who are happy, healthy, and loved with every generation? And even if we pose the question about addressing abuse and neglect as only an investment question, how do you rebase legislation and policy and therefore the service systems built upon them to address evidenced causation so that we ultimately break cycles of trauma and violence and therefore intergenerational disadvantage? How do we hear the voices of people at the heart of these issues to find the evidence and get, again, their conception of a solution? It takes a heck of a lot of courage to upend the paradigm on which modern child protection systems are based. And the foundations of the current system are always going to be hard for one person alone. But if you had to ask yourself, how do we make change happen now? That example I gave you from Western Sydney shows you how even changing the question that child protection workers ask when they enter a home or when they work with a family and how we listen completely changes productivity and outcomes. In the perfect world, we refound the very foundations of the system and we'd refound the legislation and the culture of work based on neuroscience and the evidence base of at its centre how we help people recover from trauma and parent and love children successfully. And voices would become the mandate for the work within the system. But there are things that we can do now. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much for that, Natalie. That was really comprehensive in taking us with those great examples of how systems can be built around certain assumptions and what assumptions might actually be helpful in trying to shift these. You know, we've built these systems, we can change these systems, you know, collectively we need to be able to act and think about what those, you know, it strikes me that you were talking in your bit about the removal of children and how that's kind of an assumption of, oh, there'll be good outcomes post that, like that's the end point. Actually, we know that there are often adverse outcomes from being removed and being in care. So if we're going to put a productivity lens to how that child's life turns out, and as the social impacts, then we've really got to think about this whole thing very differently and very much to your point, looking at those root causes. So Robin, I might invite you in now to just share with us a bit about your perspective on this, maybe a few reflections on what Natalie was saying, but more what you've seen in your experience. I know you've done evaluations and looked at systems change. Love to hear more about that. Then we can get into a bit of a discussion once Sharon's shared as well.
I'm just going to watch the clock there, Rani. I end up doing a lot of webinars myself, so I know what it's like when you're in your shoes. So Sharon, I'm going to be very speedy to make sure we get to you. I'm going to build on what Nat was saying, but first I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm on today, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my utter respects to elders past, present and emerging. and acknowledge that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also want to acknowledge the various groups of Aboriginal organisations that CEI works with around the country, in case you are online today, because a lot of what I'm about to say we learnt working with you. So I'm going to build a little bit on, but the first thing I want to say is systems trump programs every single time, right? So when we continually use a response of trying to find a particular program, training the workforce to do it, which we also call spray and pray, training as many people as we can and just hoping that they are able to implement it, as our main response to trying to improve the system and improve the way that we work with children and families, we aren't going to get very far. And that is through experience, I've learned that, but that's also pretty clear in implementation research now, that funding by itself doesn't work. It's important, but doesn't work. Training by itself, important, doesn't work. Using data that isn't pragmatic and makes sense to stakeholders that need to use it and using it continually doesn't work, right? But unfortunately, because it's the way the system is, we keep returning to doing the same thing over and over and over again. And most practitioners want to implement, you know, that example you gave, Nat, was a great one. They want to be able to kind of think innovatively and try different things, but often the way that practice or organizations are set up, or the way that contracts are issued to organizations, don't allow them to do that. You know, there's kind of deliverables that they need to meet for funding. So there's just so much stuff. So one thing I'd start with is the data that we use to figure out who might be at risk of removal and who could be returned at home is data that's simply monitoring a system that's not working. So it's not really telling us how children and families are going in a way around their social emotional outcomes, their well-being outcomes. It's not really telling us how those kids that have been removed are going. It's sort of tracking, so using the sole indicator of reunification or removal, we'll just put all our attention on those two things, right? So the quality, and in addition to that, the quality of that data does not allow us to be more precise in meeting the needs of the people that we serve. So we don't put in the hands of practitioners valid, brief, reliable measures where they can quickly get at alongside partnering with a family and partnering with a young person what could really help them and how that could be implemented with very high quality. Because what matters, a program innovation, what we do matters, but how we do it sometimes matters more, right? The quality of how we do things. So that would be one. The second would be making sure that where there is a good evidence base that has been around for a while, there have been program after program after program that's been designed to try and prevent or decrease child maltreatment. They're often made up of similar things because there's only so much things you can do with humans. And sometimes the way that they're structured don't fit our systems. And if there's no room for careful adaptation of the way these are designed, they just can't fit in the system that we're doing. We're doing some very interesting work with the Victorian government down here that's enabling, we hope, a quicker use of more flexible evidence in practice to improve systems as is, rather than using, you know, a programmatic approach every time. So this issue of making of helping be more adaptable when we're working in a system would really, really help, we think, because what it is trying to get the best quality we can into the hands of the front line and making sure that we invest more in supervision and coaching for them. The support that the front line get for the work that they're doing and the way that they are trying to, and the support that children and families get, we could just do so much better if we were able to support that workforce with evidence-based supervision and coaching, with more rapid use of data to help with decisions. So there's this kind of more precision, a bit more evidence in the way that we're delivering what we're delivering, but also better support for the workforce. You know, very good coaching has been shown in many studies in the US for frontline child protection workers decreases turnover. You know, it's like anybody in their job that gets good support to do it are likely to stay in it longer. And finally, because I want to make sure we get to Sharon, is we got to find the fit. So there's a thing that we talk about a lot. So you've got a what, so it might be the casework you're doing, or an intervention, or a program, or whatever the what is. That what sits in the context of the organizations that deliver it in our system, right? And that organization needs to find the fit and do some things, some change within their organization to support the better implementation of that innovation. Often we solely try to train the workforce, but we don't do anything around them to help them better implement that innovation and what they're doing. And then we need to find the fit with the wider system. So if the way we're designing policies actually in the end goes totally against the innovation they're trying to implement, that will stall implementation. So implementation research, implementation science pays a lot of attention to trying to get those three areas to find the fit back and forth, and then to better use data to continually try and monitor and improve it. And last point, what was striking about your first slide, Nat, was in the public health approach, or anyone, people sometimes, we get asked to help people scale a lot. Scaling is really hard. And scaling's not just implementing in more places. The general definition of scaling is you get to about 70% of the population that could be supported by what you're trying to do. 70%. That's scaling, right? That is a whole other thing. And in Australia, we really do struggle because of the way our systems are and the way our federation is. We do struggle to scale things, but also scale with adaptation for local context. Because again, like systems, context is king. It really, really matters where it is that you're doing what you're doing and how you do it. So that would be my kind of wish. If we were diverting some resources or putting more attention, I'd love to see more of that go to supporting higher quality implementation. Thank you.
That's great, Robin. I think, we don't hear enough about how the implementation goes. We often hear about more innovation, but actually how are we implementing and then tweaking based on the data? Who's collecting the data? Where's it going? Who's analyzing it? Where's the sense making, rather than just starting off with another program down the road? So lots to pick up on.
For ministers, and it's not as like implementing is the thing that you kind of, okay, now go and implement now. It's not as
accessible. Yeah. So we have to think beyond those election cycles, and how do we bring that? So lots to get into the discussion. We do have till 4:30, so that's great. We've got a bit more time. So Sharon, I wanted to bring you in, and really, I'm sure you've got lots to comment on from what Natalie and Robin said, but if you could just talk a bit about your work with children and, their experience of communities and also their experience of poverty and inequality, your work that you've been doing that's so valuable to bring to this discussion.
Thanks so much, Rani, and thanks, Nat and Robin. Amazing listening to both of you. And I think I could just say what they said and stop, because I'm not sure how much I can add to it. But I do want to kind of broaden out a little bit and think beyond the child protection system as such to the kind of broader structures and broader society, so we can think perhaps in different ways about prevention from the ways we currently think. My slides are up. I love a good slide, so I'm hoping they're good slides. I'm making a huge assumption here. I love a slide. So I'll share the slides with you. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I am in the south of Canberra on the beautiful and unceded lands of the Ngunnawal people. And in the work that we do with children, one of the things that we are so conscious of is that we can learn so much as a society about the care for children, about connecting children to their community, connecting children to country, if we just listen to the incredible wealth and wisdom of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. And of course, we have the opportunity this year, next month, to say yes to a proposition that will make an enormous difference to children for generations to come. So in this presentation, in this talk, I just wanted to raise 3 points that I think are really important in terms of challenging us to think about broad-based prevention and how we can change things. Nadia, maybe you could just go on to the next slide. So the 3 points that I wanted to make is that, one, we need to invest much more in essential infrastructure and to track spending on children. So this is beyond child protection systems specifically. This is about how we can really shift our society towards a society that is much more inclusive of and supportive of all children, particularly children who are experiencing challenges and families who are experiencing challenges. And so to do this, I think we need a targeted public health approach, and Nat's done a beautiful job of explaining a public health approach. But we need that approach to be both child-centred or at least child-inclusive, to be aimed at reducing poverty and inequality. And I'll unpack all of that in just a minute. I also want to say a little bit about the need to invest in middle childhood, and then just to say something very briefly about education. So Nadia, if you could jump to the next slide, that would be great. So I wanted to just share with you some of the research that we've been doing with children aged between around 6 and 12 or 13 about what matters to them. And this is research with children who are growing up in contexts of poverty. Now, it's really important to make clear at the beginning of this that we must never mistake poverty for neglect. And we must never make assumptions about those connections. But I think we also need to recognise that when families are living in contexts of poverty, it's incredibly hard for parents to give their children a fair go because the systems and the structures are working against them. And I'd also say that to the extent that we think about poverty and neglect, poverty is an example of state neglect, particularly in a wealthy country like Australia. It's an example of systems being designed not to support people in ways that are fair and equitable. So based on our research with children about what matters to them, we've developed a child-centred framework for understanding and responding to poverty, and that framework's in front of you now. And it has the 3 dimensions of the material basics, opportunities, and strong and supportive relationships. Now, this is not about indicators, it's not about data, or not entirely. It's fundamentally about values and what we think is important based on what we hear from children. And when these dimensions are in place, when none of these things are missing, then children are safe and supported. And of these 3 dimensions, perhaps the most important is the relational dimension. And this is something we often don't think about enough. But what we hear in our research is that when parents are under unbearable pressure, it's impossible for them to give children everything that they need because parents are just overwhelmed. And that overwhelmed experience of parents and of their children is often about structural factors, and it's about systems failing families. It's not about individual shame or individuals doing something wrong. It's about those systems and those structures. Nadia, if you could jump to the next slide, that would be great. So if we can put all of these things in place, then ideally there will be no child poverty, and that would improve children's safety and wellbeing remarkably. Now, we might say it's utopian thinking to be talking about no child poverty, but we consistently rank as a nation as the top 1 or 2 on wealth and assets. In a country this wealthy, our aim should be to end child poverty, not to reduce it, but to end it. And in the research that we do with children who are doing it really tough, I can't imagine deciding which of those children should still be allowed to live in poverty because we're only aiming to reduce it rather than end it. Now, in practice, ending child poverty is a generational task, but that has to be our aim, to actually end child poverty. So across these 3 dimensions, we need a targeted public health approach that focuses on investment that's child-centred and connects across these 3 dimensions, that moves beyond silos. And we need investment in physical infrastructure, including green infrastructure, so that's places to play. We need service infrastructure that's child-friendly, that's affordable and accessible. There's been a lot of discussion in Australia about universal basic income, but we also critically need to think about systems that will deliver universal basic services, because currently many families don't have those services. And we need social infrastructure. We need to invest in relationships, both within families, but also within communities, so families have a web of support. Nadia, could you jump to the next slide? And we also need a high-level political commitment. And part of this is around how we track spending. So one of the things that I would propose we need to think about is firstly a Child Poverty Reduction Act. I would prefer it to be a Child Poverty Elimination Act, but the language is generally there, a Child Poverty Reduction Act that commits government across parties, across Parliament, across states and territories to ending child poverty in Australia. And we also need a child poverty budget statement along the lines of the Women's Budget Statement, so that spending is transparent and accountable. And we also need child poverty impact assessments in critical areas. And some of the most important areas where we need to assess impacts on children are areas where we don't normally consider children at all. So welfare and social security policies, but particularly employment and housing. And Nadia, if you could just jump onto the next slide. I just wanted to say a little bit about housing, because it's actually rare that we think about children in any serious way in housing policy and development, but we really must. So housing is an essential human need, it's an essential basic need, and it's a fundamental human right. And in our research, we hear children talk about the devastation that's caused by homelessness, of their experience of living in a car, of living in a tent in someone's backyard, of being in emergency accommodation. So housing is essential. But if housing is poorly designed or inadequate, then housing can meet basic needs, but damage children's opportunities and relationships. So many of the children in our research have a roof over their heads, but no place to play. Their homes are overcrowded, and there is nowhere, inside or outside, for children, or indeed their parents, to find a space of their own. And so the pressures become like a pressure cooker. And this impacts on children's quality of life. It impacts on their physical activity, on their safety, and on their opportunities for creative or imaginative play. But it also creates that pressure cooker, as I said. As we invest in more affordable housing, and indeed all housing in Australia, it must be fit for children. It must have green spaces, it must have play areas, places for children to run, to climb a tree, and places for people to be together. Because if we don't, we're going to entrench disadvantage and multidimensional poverty for some children for generations to come. And that will be a policy choice. And it's a policy choice that will mean that many children are not safe and supported, and it will increase the likelihood of child protection issues becoming entrenched. Nadia, can you jump to the next slide, which is the second last one I wanted to share? And this is the second major point that I wanted to make. And this is around how we invest in middle childhood. There's a really strong focus on the early years, and that's a great thing, and it's for all good reasons. The evidence around the importance of the first 2,000 days is just unarguable. And we also see a reignition of policy as young people start to approach adulthood, as they move from the end of school into employment and are seen as becoming productive citizens. And yet policies and services around the middle years are often missing. And of course, we do have a strong policy focus on school, but while school is critical to children's lives, to their experiences now and to their future possibilities and opportunities, it's not the entirety of their lives. And schools are completely overstretched and can't cope with the multitude of seemingly endless issues and challenges that are cast to them to resolve. And so we really need a focus on middle childhood to complement the early years focus and to prevent this policy cliff that so many children and families are falling off. And Nadia, if you could jump to the final slide. I just wanted to raise this point, and I think this is beyond what we can talk about today, but there is endless discussion in Australia about education. And I think we do need to recognise the critical role that education plays. We need to value education and schools and the incredible work that teachers do, while recognising that our current system is just not working and is in such urgent need of reform. It's in urgent need of greater equity and of funding, particularly more equitable funding. But what we are hearing is the extent to which schools and individual teachers are trying to pick up the pieces when society is letting children down, and that includes trying to navigate issues of child protection in a classroom of 28 or 30 children, all of whom have considerable needs, including simply the need to be listened to. And so, as I said, I think in all of this, we need to recognise that schools can't do it all. And so investing in children, we need to recognise the centrality of schools, but never pretend that investment in education is all that's needed. Because investing in just that silo for children is failing us. We need to understand the entirety of children's lives and make the connections and invest accordingly. So I'll stop there and you can stop sharing the slides, Nadia.
Thanks so much, Sharon. That was a great way to round out the conversation, really, and bring children to the fore again. I have so many places I want to go with this discussion, but I'm going to start with the lack of coordination. So we've all agreed that, yes, the systems are a problem. So we've talked about the problem. They're all kind of a bit silo-y. They're not really talking to each other. That example that you gave, Sharon, about, there's a roof over their head, but it's not meeting all their needs, for children. They're not actually able to thrive in that environment. Schools are being asked to do a lot of child protection-y sort of work that is beyond their scope of what they're meant to be doing. So there's a lack of that coordination and alignment. And we know that there's also, often discussion of prevention being adult services being able to really focus on children and the parent's role in that and bringing children so that they're not lost if it's a drug and alcohol service and you go, are you a parent? How's the child? So we talk about all of these things, but how does that actually work when we think about, and I want us to just kind of wrestle with this problem. I know that none of you might have the silver bullet answer, but it's a good thing to discuss and unpack from your different expertise. When we know funding and contracts are quite specific and, quite prescriptive in what you can do. And speaking of prescriptions, even like if you go to the GP where we often go, oh, they're the primary health people, they can be there, they can triage people to these services if they need them, they can talk about children, but they see you for 15 minutes and that's after you've remortgaged your house to pay for them, because it's really expensive to get to a good GP nowadays. Hardly any of them bulk bill. Regional areas, it's even harder. So what do you suggest in that sense of, we want all these services to be more child inclusive or child focused, and we want them to be able to talk to each other so that, the overall outcome is a better chance for a child to thrive. But how do we actually make that happen? Or do you have any ideas, or have you seen any models? Any reflections on that? Sharon, you're nodding, so I'll go with you.
Well, I think probably both Robin and Natalie have more, probably more sort of practical things to bring to this conversation. But I think where I would start with this is saying that much of this is about what we value. And I think we often leave that conversation of what is it that we value and what do we want out of conversations around funding. But funding, funding is often, it often reflects what it is that we consider to be most important. But in those conversations, we leave children out of the equation, excepting, of course, around school. And around, some of those areas where we assume children should be. And so I think one of the starting places is to say, what kind of society do we actually want? What are the values that we want to underpin our society? And where does care fit into all of this? Because this is about not just how much we spend, but how we spend it and what kinds of values and principles we're basing that spending on. And I think very often we focus on efficiency, or we focus on what the outputs might be, but we don't factor in the importance of bringing care into the conversation. And so I think the starting point has to be, what is it that we want our society to look like, and what are we prepared to spend in order to achieve that? If we ask most individuals about what's most important to them, their children or the children in their lives are usually at the very top of the list. And then somehow when we get into conversations about budgets, children disappear off the agenda. And so I think it's about bringing into the conversation what it is we really value as our starting point.
Thank you. Natalie.
I'm going to go out there and suggest that Robin is going to have a far better answer than me, and I'm going to steal some of her lines.
It's not a competition.
I already know Robin beats me hands down on most things, so that's all right. I'm cool with that. I bow down. But I do think it's those implementation science kind of issues that Robin has brought up. For me, lack of coordination is a symptom of a much broader issue. If you look at some of the, if we looked at child protection system as a whole, and I know that I can tend towards we need to burn it down and start the whole thing again. We're coming from a very outdated paradigm, but the paradigm that we have is actually what creates all of the behaviours and the way people work, and they're working to a master of must keep removals down or must keep removals up, or how many, my caseload. And then we've got a health system that works to a different set of KPIs, and everybody is busy working to the master of their system, when in fact there is no alignment between our prior goals, which is effectively what Sharon is saying as well. But I think we have some systems that have grown up and created a bunch of unintended consequences because they've moved so far off script from their purpose. And the health system, when families come into contact with the health system, their KPI may be how many beds I've got and how quickly I can get this child out of this bed. And there will be different actors in the system who see the irony and the chaos of it all and want to change it. But so often we see those people working to spite a system, not because of it. Robin, you're going to say something far more profound. I know this.
I want to hear the solution to that, Robin.
Setting me up. The there's a couple of things just again to add to what the other two were saying. It's very difficult to implement something that's very ill-defined. So even talking about being child-focused, like, okay, or person-centered, or so a lot of our social systems, including mental health, are sort of run by principles. So people will often ask us to come and sort of help supercharge their implementation of a model or service reform they're doing or something. And 9 times out of 10, when we have a look at what they're doing, it's difficult to implement. So everyone's going to have another interpretation of it or not really understand. So that, I think that's one thing that gets in the way, is we don't get a little bit more detailed about what we're talking about when we're talking about being child-centered. Like, what would it look like if I was doing that? The second thing is, we don't role ambiguity, right? So role ambiguity is one of the biggest barriers to implementing something well and sustainably. And if people don't quite know what their role is in their workplace or in the system, we did an evaluation of a particular thing in Australia, and we found the role ambiguity between the family support workers and the child protection workers was one of the major barriers to the implementation of this effort. They weren't too sure who was meant to be doing what, and so often nothing essentially was done, or it was done by 2 people kind of overdoing it almost. So there's sort of, again, and that's a bit like the ambiguity of what we mean by being child focused. And then, so again, defining, making sure that people understand what their roles are. And then we get what we measure. So it goes back to the point I was saying before. We should be measuring, are we reaching the people that we thought we were? And if not, why not, right? Are we implementing in a way that we thought we would? And are we getting any outcome? Really pragmatic. what particular outcome are we trying to get? If we just tried to kind of hone pragmatically to those three things when we were delivering, of course, there's lots of other things that systems need to measure, but there's an enormous amount of data that we're collecting, we're not using, or doesn't help you make any decisions, doesn't sort of drive good decision making. And then we've done a lot of work with various royal commissions over the years, particularly when it comes to implementing recommendations post a commission, and we've done very poorly implementing almost everything post royal commissions. We did a piece of work a long time ago with a team, and we found of sort of 300 odd recommendations that we looked at to see whether they were implemented or not. The one that was most commonly implemented was building jails. If the recommendation was build a jail, we're really, really good at it. If the recommendation was providing training and workforce development, it was hardly ever implemented well. Yeah. So it's sort of, we get what we pay attention to, and it's not like the people in the system. So, you know, often families in child protection are also mental health, or also in the health system, or often the juvenile justice system. It's not like those great people in our system don't know that, but the way we've sort of structured it almost prevents them from trying to do work in a different way. And one thing that would be cool, because every once in a while you get a breakthrough, right? You get a breakthrough where a group of people manage to do it, or they manage to get some innovation through in the way they're working, or they manage to create a coalition of mental health people and child protection people, a bit like how you do in the health system with multidisciplinary teams. When they do that, we should figure out how they do that. We spend a lot of time describing how we haven't done things or what's not working, but when sometimes things do work, we don't sort of stop and go, okay, quickly, let's figure out why that worked, and let's figure out what they did that was different, and let's see if we can do that again in another place. So I think that sort of celebration of, and again, you can't implement, I say this often, with a Gantt chart, right? That's not implementing, that's project management. Implementation is thinking through all the core components that you need. What does the workforce need to do? What other support do they need? What kind of data do we need to collect? What do we need to do with our HR systems so we're hiring the right people? And then finally, and I can say this because my partner is the head of social work at Monash University. We need to get really, really good at training people at universities for the job that they need to do when they come out, right? Because often there's this worker who's always stayed in my head where she said to me, first day on the job, child protection worker, she was handed a file and told to go to court for this family, day one, right? So can you imagine? Like, so the preparation, we have to take that really seriously, the way we take preparation for our healthcare system. Like, we have to take it super seriously. And I know there's some innovative stuff happening between some governments and universities, but there's just something there, again, to make sure people have the right skills, or at least the base skills that they need to you know, start as well as they can on the job. So that's fine.
Robin, your point about the training is so critical, because actually there are a number of jurisdictions which do not require a university education before you become a child protection worker, and there are TAFE degrees and so on. And the story you give of somebody turning up to work on the first day as a child protection worker and being handed the court documents, I'm sure will be one that many people on this meeting will have countless examples in their mind. But the point you raise about celebrating examples where it works reminds me really strongly of why the public service can actually look to the community services sector and the community control sector to see some of this. And I would love to share with you an exact example of what you've just talked about. When we were going around the country and engaging with different Aboriginal community controlled organisations for our review of Closing the Gap, there was an incredible Aboriginal community controlled organisation in Perth, which runs both child protection support as well as mental health service delivery with state government funding. And as much as we need to burn the system down and start the paradigm again, I can see these pockets of incredible examples where you're seeing this change even within what might be considered quite a suffocating constrictive paradigm. And here's an example where your concept of we're led by what we're measured really matters. So we know that a lot of the funding contracts specify KPIs that don't really align with what an Aboriginal community values out of the service that's being funded by government. And the conversation started with a particular organisation and government saying, look, what you're measuring here for the funding that you're giving us resembles nothing like what our community values out of child protection support or mental health. And your mainstream focus of delivery is all about just treating the individual, not the family that they're going back to, not the community environment they're in, instead of measuring change even within a family or a community, how they're supporting a person. That conversation then led to eventually an agreement by the state government to hand over some power. Yes, here's the money, tell us what this service model should look like. Again, that goes back to that closing the gap agreement that all governments signed up to share power and share decision making. We don't often see that relinquishment of control by governments to the service that is well loved and well understood by the community and vice versa. Within 12 months, 97% of the kids and families serviced by that community with that community controlled organisation's own service model for both mental health and child protection, 97% of those families did not come to the attention of the child protection system again for a minimum of 12 months. It shows you where governments may need to step back and actually listen to the community itself, even just around measurement, because the measurement can actually lead that whole dialogue. Again, it's the what we value leading the change with the service delivery.
I think that's
Can I just make a comment there, Ronnie? Sorry,
no,
I know just want to comment on the measurement issue. And Robin, I think you made the point that we have an incredible wealth of data in Australia, and we have a lot of data about children. But one of the issues that we see again and again is that data ends up driving it. So, the data that we have drives us into the future, and that data may not be what we need to know about, and it may not be what we need to understand and what we need to measure, but we get caught in a data trap because what we have determines what we measure, and what we measure somehow becomes determinant of what we value, and that's the wrong way around. So we need to flip that about, and that's example I think is such a powerful one of that. I wanted to make one comment too about that really important point that Robin made about definitional clarity and what we mean. And I think we often use terms without being clear on what they are. And so we hear, we use the terms child-friendly, child-inclusive, child-centred, often interchangeably. And I think it's important to make distinctions. And I just wanted to point to some work that we've done where we've aimed to look at these ideas and to make a distinction between being child-inclusive and child-centred. And so child inclusiveness is when we don't position children as the primary focus, but we recognise that they are a primary focus among others and that they're key stakeholders. Whereas child-centredness is about children's needs and human rights and interests being the primary focus. And so then children being part of decision-making and the outcomes for children become the explicit priority. But I think making those distinctions is really important, because when we're talking about issues like child protection, we may not always be child-centred because we might be focusing on the family. And so I would argue we always need to be child-inclusive, but not necessarily child-centred. But providing some clarity around what we mean is really important so we don't gallop off on the wrong track. And so often we talk about children's voices, whereas really that might not be the primary focus. And if we're talking about being child-centred and having children involved in decision-making, then we need to be prepared to listen to children and to act. When we're being child-inclusive, that may not be where we land. So I think that definitional clarity really matters.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really key point about accountability as well. I think often in this sector it is difficult around the funding cycles and the sorts of contracts you get, and like we're saying in terms of the data collection, the KPIs, to get caught up in just collecting that rather than being accountable for that ultimate goal that we had set out for. Are children doing better? that, like the example Natalie gave earlier of those workarounds that frontline workers often have to make in order to achieve the goal for the family, but that's not their strict kind of role. And the best workers, we heard from Dr. Paul Gray yesterday, who's an academic in New South Wales, and he was speaking on a webinar around Safe and Supported, the National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children. And he was talking from the First Nations perspective, and he said, you know, the best workers are those that know the best workarounds and they can get away with it. And that shouldn't be the case. The system should be setting up workers for success, not setting them up so they have to do workarounds to get to that goal, which is holistic support for the child, not just doing their bit and then churning them through the system. And I remember when I worked at Mission Australia many years ago, we, you know, I was in the policy team, but we were looking at all the housing support services we had, and you just see the churn between all the organisations that were providing support to homeless men and young people at that time. And it was because they could only stay for 25 days or whatever was mandated. Then at the 25 days, they'd pack their bag and then they'd move down the road to the Anglicare one, and then they'd pack, and you know, and it was like, what is going on here? Like, so the, you know, NGOs finally got together and had a bit of a conversation, went, oh, we all know about Barry, and you know, but because their funding was that way, it was, they needed to tick off people and say that they've moved them on and they'd provided services. But Barry's problems weren't going to be solved by just 25 days in this particular centre. You know, there was much more to that story. So there's so much that's known in the front line and in the implementation and the practice, but that policymakers often say that they're aware of it, but there's obviously a disconnect somewhere. And you know, I also wanted to touch on the fact of, you know, that middle childhood gap, the fact that, you know, it's really hard to talk about poverty. Child abuse and neglect itself is a really difficult issue to get up there and say, you know, we really need to look at this differently and fund this differently. And as you said, Robin, out of the, was it you, Robin, or Natalie, out of the Royal Commission recommendations, if building the jails was, you know, taken up, that's, yay, let's do that. So I wonder if there's something here about those values that Sharon mentioned earlier. You know, is there a way that we need to be having these conversations differently about these particular critical issues? Because we're not bringing people along, we're not finding, you know, that punitive response to build more jails, put more young people in detention seems to be the kind of response that we prefer. But when you talk to ordinary Australians, that's not the, you know, so what do you think in your experience and expertise is going on there, especially when you know that, you know, governments obviously do want to increase productivity, they do want to invest in, you know, children doing well and prospering into the future. So what is the disconnect here? I'll go to Natalie first. Natalie's nodding.
Well, I think this really goes to the heart of, if we know all this stuff, why aren't we seeing any change? And I guess I'm nodding wildly because I'm in Queensland, and I'm sure many of you are well aware of the increase in incarceration of children and young people, not just in youth detention centres here, but the move now to have children even serve sentences in watch houses. And that will disproportionately affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people. Governments well know that detention policies don't reduce recidivism. And I do think governments well know that they aren't necessarily moves that will keep the community safer. Do they know that the way child protection systems are currently founded will not ultimately reduce cycles of intergenerational trauma? I query that. But at the end of the day, something that I have seen continually across my career is that the evidence base isn't always the first base for change. And I think I started my life thinking that all you had to do was win the hearts and minds of the senior bureaucrats and of the ministers. And what I've learned across time is that you actually have to win the hearts of the public first, and then they will turn their minds to the evidence. So people will often make a decision based on their own morals or their own values or their own history. They'll have their own unconscious bias for a particular thing, and they may then go and look for evidence to support that. evidence can ultimately become a bit of a secondary consideration. So win the hearts first, the minds will follow. And the reason I say that is if you have a look around things like child protection, domestic and family violence, over the last 20 years, you'll actually find there are a bunch of what I call cost of reports. Back in 2004, I think, was the first cost of domestic and family violence to the Australian Economy report. Back in 2010, I think Deloitte may, or Access Economics may have done a cost of child abuse to the Victorian economy. These particular things talk about the cost of these problems and give us the evidence base, even just from a financial perspective, about why we need to reorient our views, even if people don't see the moral reasons why. But what we have to do is actually educate the broader public to create that mandate for the governments and the politicians to change. Cost benefit analyses can sometimes be a nice form of evidence base because what they're showing is how drastic the cost of the status quo is versus what we could move to, and that's a much more tangible thing. But even that is an evidence base that won't necessarily move governments on the case for change. I really feel that it's what they consider the public mandate to be. And sadly, I often see the evidence play sicker can fiddle in areas like youth justice, where there might be a view that the people, for example, of Queensland want a tough on crime policy. There's been some public surveying recently of a research agency which actually says there is a level of dissonance within the community around something like youth justice. People will say on the one hand that they know that carceral policies, detention policies don't work. But then when you ask them what they want the response to youth crime to be, they say, "I'll lock them up." So how do we have this dissonance amongst our community and our public perceptions that actually don't meet? So I think that in an area like child protection, to the unedified, to those who are incensed by what they hear in the media about these horrific child abuse cases, which they should be incensed by, many of them will think removal of that child was the only palatable option. But I think all of this leaves us to question what the role of government is in educating the broader public about causation, around what we heard Ben Matthews speak to so eloquently on Monday at the Governor General event that NAPCAN hosted, which is we need to change some norms in society around supporting families and what's okay. We heard that the emotional and psychological abuse of children is one of the most common and prevalent forms of abuse. How are we changing perceptions and understanding of what is constituted by that and how to change? So I think there is a real role for governments in educating the public so that there's an appetite for a productive solution.
Thanks, Natalie. And before I invite Sharon or Robin to jump in, if they've got something they want to share on that sort of, how do we talk about this? I do want to say tomorrow we have a webinar in the morning that is really about framing and talking about this. And Nat Kendall-Taylor from the Frameworks Institute will be talking with Annette Michaud and with Helen Fogarty from our team about framing and really how do we have these conversations so we can get through and cut through the noise that people are hearing, because there are salience biases that are out there where, the first thing you think about when you think about child abuse is the media, and you probably think about sexual abuse, or, there's certain tropes that are just pulled out there, and that doesn't help us have a productive conversation about prevention and supporting families. It just stigmatizes families more, makes them less likely to seek help themselves because they don't want to be one of those families, and also doesn't help us progress those conversations around systems changes, because people think it is, this abhorrent act that just happens over there, rather than the prevalence is actually quite high. And the more pressures families are under, the more difficult it is to be a responsive, caring parent amongst all the other responsibilities you have. So Sharon and Robin, did you want to jump in on that, or there's something else I just want to touch on?
I was going to just actually say your webinar tomorrow is exactly what people should watch around. Nat is so good at calling out, you know, why would you call people vulnerable? Who wants to be known as vulnerable? Like who's, you know, I just wanted to add it's not just the public, it's the media. Like it's just relentless. Everything is bad. It's just bad. Like you'd think like the climate, and then young people, those poor 2 young kids with autism up in Queensland that were, I mean, what a story that is, right? What an absolute failure of the system to take care of them, how vulnerable. I mean, I just can't imagine. So there is some system failures that I think give the media, probably the media gives it a little bit too much attention, but also it does, if you didn't know it, you just think things are burning down. So again, sort of trying to kind of highlight where things have actually worked, where there is, I was trying to remember his name, for this incredible researcher up in Queensland, I will find his name, and he did a webinar for us that we're doing some work with Movember around men's mental health, young people in particular. And boy, have we got a lot to do there. And he works in, is an Aboriginal man, and he works in jails with young people, and just the practical, doable solutions he's coming up with to help get these young men back on track. Like more of that, please, you know. And that's like a man at a university doing his thing. Yeah. So I think again, there are some good things that work, and people are really trying. And again, you know, if we keep implementing Scared Straight, the evidence was already shown that Scared Straight, putting kids in jails to try and scare them to prevent crime, makes them worse. They commit more crime. It increases recidivism. That is very, very clear in the evidence. So anytime anybody says they're going to implement that, we should be yelling from the top of this, you know, that makes intuitive sense to some areas of politics, but it makes them worse. So, and we know that. It's a scientific fact.
Absolutely. And I think, Robin, that's the point, though. What does media see as their role? They see their role as getting people to click through, and the sensational stories are the ones that are getting them click through, rather than those positive stories of change. And we've got to help bring people along in terms of building those relationships with journalists, etc., and saying this is the, you know, this is the ultimate aim, and how do we make that system change. And I just wanted to say the child maltreatment study showed us that children who experience maltreatment are more likely to go on and have serious mental health conditions. So prevention really needs to start there, but we're talking about these things like they're separate, and they're not. They're really interrelated. Sharon, sorry, just wanted to see if you had a quick thought on that one.
Just a quick thought that occurred as I'm listening to both Ned and Robin. I think, you know, the importance of showing what works is clear, but I think we also need to think about what doesn't work differently, because this is really hard. You know, it's not as though there are some solutions that are there and are apparent, but there are lots of things where the solution isn't clear, and the solution at best is very complex. And so things will fail. But when governments fail, when a policy fails, when a program fails, the tendency is to jump onto that and to be hypercritical. And so governments will fail a previous government, but it's a very brave government that would say, we tried this and it failed, so we're going to try something else. And yet, if we want to learn and to move forward, we need to give license to governments and to other actors to be able to say, we recognise that failed, and so we're going to do it differently, rather than that being political or organisational death.
Absolutely.
We're getting asked to do more and more work on de-implementation. So it's a really hot, like, on undoing, because we tend to pile it on. We don't tend to kind of, so I've noticed in the last couple of years, it's become a bit of a, can you come and help us de-implement something? Like,
that's great, because otherwise it becomes this really convoluted patchwork of things that just don't help. We can see that in the dropping off the edge reports, for example. You know, the data shows communities are stuck in these cycles where they're really, you know, got lots of entrenched issues, whereas lots of services and investment has gone in, but clearly they're just being tacked on top of each other, so they're not really achieving the goals that are needed. And to your point, Sharon, you know, being able to fail and learn is so important, because otherwise every time you have a child death in foster care or in child protection, there's this punitive response and this need to kind of do more of the protecting bit, you know, invest more in the tertiary response, rather than saying, you know, this is a horrific, like traumatic thing to have occurred, but we need to learn from what happened. But the response isn't just to put more there, but to look at the system as a whole and how we could have prevented that whole trajectory for that child. It's nearly time to end, so I was going to ask each of you for a positive note to end on in all of this, like where do we go from here? And I just wanted to share that I know, Natalie, you talked about shared decision making, and you know, it's really positive that in the new safe and supported plan for the national framework for protecting Australia's children, there is such an emphasis of shared decision making with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders and the sector, and you know, there's equal representation with government. So I think that's a really strong positive step. Let's see if it leads to the results that we're all hoping for. But it is really positive for government to step back and share some of that decision-making power and actually model. So if the evidence is here, we all know, and we know that this theme of this week is where we start matters. What's the main thing you think should be the starting point? So if where we start matters, where's the point we should start? Your thoughts, Sharon?
Well, I think where we need to start is with relationships and ensuring that we support strong relationships for children, and that means looking at the way in which structures are putting pressure on those relationships, or the way in which systems are failing. And I mean, the conditionality that we've seen around government benefits, particularly for single parents over the last couple of decades, is an example of how a set of policies and the systems that they sit within have undermined relationships. So the first thing I would say is that we need to put relationships absolutely at the centre. And Rani, just a really quick positive note, I guess in the 25 years that I've been doing research with children and on children's issues, we have seen remarkable shifts about the way we think about children, the way we think about children's rights, and even having these kinds of conversations. And so I think we've got a long way to go, but we have come a very long way.
That's fantastic. So Robin, a positive and a where should we start? Where's the next bit we should tackle first?
Oh, I mean, a positive is that we have some incredible people in this sector who are hanging in there, right? So some of us have been around for quite a while, and there are still a lot of us who have been around for quite a while. So I think that shows determination to do better. And if you think of the size of the SNAKE conference this week in Darwin, that's the biggest conference they've ever had. That's pretty amazing. All those people coming together to figure out how to do this better. So I think that is heartening to see. And I think in some areas in Australia that we're working in, we are working with governments and they are trying something different. You know, they are starting to publish findings from evaluations. Please do that. It's a waste when we don't, so that people don't remake the wheel and can use the learning. So please, you know, where governments are trying to do something different, and there are some genuinely trying and doing a pretty darn good job, let's keep doing that. Listening to the sector again, I mean, they are at the front. They can do some of the innovative work. So I mean, those are all really good things. You know, having a webinar like this, you know, when were we going to ever talk about evidence and implementation science? Never. So it's like, yay, here we go. I think really kind of trying to hone in on what I was saying on, yes, the focus on the what, the innovation, but let's make focusing on implementation as much as important, if not more, than finding the new program, launching it, rolling it out with some tip sheets and some training, and then going, hope this works, and then we find out that it didn't because we didn't put enough behind it to help it come to life. So just making implementation a proper thing would be great.
Natalie.
I talked about shared decision making and the fact that certainly the Productivity Commission's review of closing the gap and the way government's performing, we're not seeing shared decision making across the board with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in the systematic wholesale way that they committed under the agreement. But if you look around, you can see some small pockets where bureaucrats, not as a whole department, but as parts of department, have relinquished control and said, hey, for ages I've been telling you, yes, I'll listen, but I know best. Actually, they've said, no, the community knows best. We've got to look to some of those examples, because those examples, like I gave in Perth, are tremendous, and they show what happens when we do relinquish control back to the community. But I would say that shared decision making can't just be about organisations. We aren't giving shared decision making to the families and the children, and the predicate to shared decision making actually means listening to their diagnosis of the problem. There's too much we're going in and thinking we know exactly what's going on after 5 minutes in a house, and it's simply not the way it is. We're just disempowering people who are already traumatised. In my perfect world, we would find some way to de-implement, decommission, deactivate modern child protection systems that have really evolved from an antiquated system that grew up about 200 years ago. And we would actually say, knowing what we know helps families and children to recover and recover from trauma right now. How would we redo this whole thing in a way that puts some of those outcomes that I talked about at the very beginning at the heart of the system, not as nice to haves?
Thank you all. Lots of great ideas there, and if only we could start again, it would be a fantastic system that I'm sure collectively we'd build. But knowing what we do know, it's some great ideas of where we can start and what we need to take forward. And I guess, you know, one thing that I really hear coming through strongly is bringing the public with us, building that political will so that we can convince decision makers that we need a different way of doing this that does involve coordination and de-implementation of certain things. So thank you all for sharing your time and wisdom with us. Thank you to the audience for joining and giving your time to this important discussion. I just want to say this isn't the end of the conversation. I hope you'll take some of what we've learnt together forward in your work, talk to other colleagues about it, share this webinar when you get the recording. We'll be posting the recording to our website and emailing them to all who registered. There is a short survey that'll pop up when you close the webinar. Please do take the time to give us some feedback. We'd love to know what you enjoyed, what else you might want to see in the future, or any comments generally about what we presented today. And like I said, there is the webinar tomorrow morning on framing. It's not too late to sign up. Really important about getting our words right and how to craft messages that drive child abuse prevention so that we're actually all moving in the same direction rather than talking over each other. And do go to our website, the NAPCAN website, to find out more about the national call for a summit to prevent child maltreatment. We need to work together to have our voices heard in this call to government now, and do continue to talk to each other and share widely. So thank you for joining. Have a lovely evening and best wishes. Thanks all.